from Canada, and thanks very much to the International Socialists in Canada for inviting me to speak about my my new book, Socialism or Extinction. As Sid outlines, I think it's an important discussion as we move deeper and deeper into a global ecological crisis, which is threatening literally billions of people, and I'll come on to that. I want to start really, though, with a bit of a background about why I wrote the book. Because like many activists around the world, and particularly here in Britain, I was very heavily involved in the mobilizations that took place almost a year ago around the COP26 conference, the UN's climate conference that met last year in Glasgow. This year it's meeting in Egypt. And the book was conceived and really written in the aftermath of that conference, a conference that had seen here in Britain tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people on the streets, campaigning around all sorts of issues, but particularly focusing on the question of climate justice, raging in anger at the way climate change disproportionately hits those in society who are more oppressed, more exploited, who are poorest. That we see time and again in multiple environmental crises, and became a central focus of the climate justice movement around the Glasgow conference. And I wrote the book in response to that movement, an inspiring reawakening in many ways of the environmental movement after the COVID lockdown. But I really wrote the book as a rage of anger, because COP26, as the name suggests, represents a quarter of a century of climate conferences made by the UN, which have had almost zero impact upon the climate crisis. They represent a quarter of a century of scientists, of activists, of politicians raising the issue of the environmental crisis, particularly climate change, and demanding action from politicians and governments around the world. Yet nothing came out of Glasgow, just as very little has come out of preceding conferences that can even slow the climate crisis. So in part, my book is an explanation, an argument about why those type of conferences fail. And I want to emphasize at this point, I don't think that this is simply because people don't or haven't understood the science. In the book, I quote a US nuclear physicist called Edward Teller, who spoke at a conference organized by the American petroleum industry about the threat from climate change. And he wrote a conference that took place in 1959, and he articulates what global warming will do to cities like New York as ice caps melt and so on. It's an extraordinary insight into the way the fossil fuel industry, leading figures inside that industry, understood the possible climate crisis, yet failed to act, because acting, as will become a central theme of this talk, meant that they had to challenge or would lose out on their ability to make their profits. So we had, after COP26, a shocking scenario where once again we had failed to make any inroads in terms of the climate crisis. And really, since that conference, what we have seen around the world has underlined many of the arguments I made in the beginning of that of the book. We have seen countless climate crises, and in particular, we've seen how those crises hit the poorest people on the planet. A few weeks ago, I'm sure comrades in Canada, just as here in the UK, we watched on the news screens the impact of Hurricane Ian as it swept up Florida. There was some horrific images, stories, and so on about entire communities being destroyed. The sort of story that Sid outlined from Canada and could happen in a myriad of different places around the world. And what was fascinating watching those stories was two things for me. Firstly, the emphasis that the way in Florida the poorest communities were being impacted. Working class people were having their communities, their homes, their industries, and so on destroyed in a way that was far disproportionate to those who were better off. But what I found more interesting was the way the impact of a single hurricane in America completely obliterated any other news of climate disaster anywhere else in the world. Very rarely did you hear about the impact of that hurricane on Puerto Rico or Cuba or other parts of the West Indies. You didn't, in any national newspaper here in the UK, hear anything about the simultaneous announcement of the UN that the UN made, that in the Greater Horn of Africa, for the 5th consecutive year, the rains had fallen, pushing 50 million people into what they call acute climate crisis. You don't hear the news. It's very hard to find out but this week, something like 1.4 million Nigerian people have been displaced by flooding related to climate crisis. And of course, we heard in the last month the horrific stories from Pakistan, where something like 33 million people were displaced, and millions of people lost their farms, their communities, and their homes. The climate crisis manifests itself through all the fractures and fissures of capitalism, those of class, of race, of gender, and so on. And yet the newspapers, the media focuses on what happens in the developed world, in the global north. And in a microcosm, it's a representation of the way I think many politicians see the world, that what happens around the world matters very little unless the people are white or from more richer parts of the world. And another thing that I attempted to do in the book is to kind of explain why that takes place. And I think within the environmental movement, certainly in the last few years, there's been a growing awareness that what we require is some form of systemic change. This has been very noticeable with the slogan "System Change, not Climate Change." I see the banner in the meeting hall there on the wall says "System Change, not climate change," a slogan I think that encapsulates that recognition that there's a problem with a system that drives environmental disaster. I think this has been growing. I mean, I first got involved in environmental politics in the early 1990s, and at that time, most activists involved in environmental issues would campaign very much over what you might call individual choices, encouraging people to live their lives a particular way, to change their lifestyles in a particular way, to perhaps cycle instead of using a car, change their diet, etc., etc. I don't think that's true anymore. Certainly here in the UK, the dominant form of political activism, while that still remains a current, is to argue that there's a problem with the system. And I agree with that. And one of the fascinating and good things about the movement over the last decade or so is that a growing number of leftists, of environmentalists, of campaigners have, I think, recognized that, have articulated the way that the climate crisis is driven by the dynamics of production within the capitalist system itself. And in the book, I go into this in more detail, but just to summarize, capitalism is a system which Karl Marx called a system of competitive accumulation, where individual blocks of capital, companies or firms or multinationals, are competing against each other to maximize their profits. And they need to stay ahead of their competitors, they need to maximize their profits, and they do this by continually attempting to accumulate wealth. And that wealth accumulation is based upon the exploitation of workers, it's based upon the exploitation of human labor. And this creates an incredible dynamic. Here in Britain now, our current Prime Minister, though nobody knows how long she'll actually last, whether she'll make the end of next week, but Liz Truss has raised this rhetoric about the anti-growth coalition, quite firmly stating out the lines, if you like, of demarcation between the ruling class, big business and so on, and the rest of it, that what they're fascinated in and focused on is the need to grow the economy constantly, to maximize profits, to maximize wealth, irrespective of the impact on the environment, the impact on people, communities, and so on. And one of the important things to note about capitalism, apart from that accumulation at the heart of it, that drive to maximize profit, is that all production is based at some form upon the natural world. The natural world is a source of resources, a place to dump pollution and so on. And so maximizing growth, maximizing accumulation of wealth invariably means a degradation of the environment, the use of resources, the pollution of oceans, waters, air, and so on. So simultaneously, as you get an economy that's endlessly attempting to expand, companies endlessly trying to maximize their profits, at some point they're also endlessly degrading the natural world. And this argument, which I outline in the book, isn't particularly uncommon, I think, in the movement. I think there are a number of excellent left-wing writers and environmentalists, figures like George Monbiot here in the UK, or Naomi Klein over there in Canada, who would articulate a very similar analysis of capitalism, that it's capitalism's drive to maximize profit that ultimately drives the destruction of the environment. But what I wanted to do in the book is to take that thing one step further. Because if you have that analysis, if you understand that capitalism is the problem, then actually your conclusion has to be a revolutionary one. You have to say it's not enough to try and improve capitalism, it's not enough to try and green it or make it less oppressive, less exploitative. Actually, you have to end the whole system itself. And it's there perhaps that I might differ from some of those aforementioned writers, because what I think ends up happening with all too many leftists is that they have a brilliant analysis of what's wrong with capitalism, but actually no strategy or vision, if you like, of an alternative way of organizing society, alternative way of organizing production and so on, that could be sustainable, both in terms of the impact upon the natural world and on the impact of ordinary people. And it raises, these discussions, I think, raise the question of revolution. They raise the question of a movement that can overthrow the old order and introduce a new way of organizing society. Now, I'm very, very aware that when you talk about revolution, it means a million things to a million people. It can mean the cutting off of the head of a monarch during the French Revolution. And incidentally, today is the anniversary of the execution of Marie Antoinette, for those people who like to hang their rhetoric on particular points. It might mean guerrilla armies hiding out in the jungles and attacking symbols of the state. What I mean by revolution, and what I write and articulate in the book, is actually a movement from below, a vast movement of participation by ordinary people in the overthrow of the old order and the creation of a new one. I'm not talking about the revolution transformation of society through the actions of a handful of individuals. I do not believe that is possible. And to explain and articulate this in the book, I look at a number of historic events to try and draw out some lessons. Now, I do this for a number of reasons. Partly, I think it's important that we celebrate our history, the history that is often hidden from us, the history that is often distorted in academia and the education system. I also do it because I think there's a new generation of environmentalists and socialists and trade unionists and activists around the world who need to learn some of these lessons from the past. Just as revolutionaries of the past learned lessons from the movements of their time, we can learn lessons from the past. And so in the book, I give kind of 4 case studies, you might call them, of revolutionary history. The first is the 1871 Paris Commune, when the workers, the ordinary women and men of Paris, took over the city, expelled the ruling class, expelled the bosses, the government, the military leaders, and so on, and ran society on a completely different basis for around 3 months, holding off counter-revolutionary forces until they were eventually overwhelmed by the right and the counter-revolution. And from the Paris Commune of 1871, we can learn a number of important things. Firstly, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and people like that at the time looked at the Paris Commune and understood it as a new form of workers' democracy, a new form of democracy from below, where leaders were democratically elected, were held accountable to the people who elected them, who were paid not vast salaries, but were paid the average wage of working people. They saw how the Paris Commune destroyed the old capitalist state and formed a new state to manage the affairs of workers and protect the revolutionary movement. And so what I try to do in the book is develop some of those arguments and show how they're relevant to the environmental movement and to struggles to today. The second revolution I talk about is the Russian Revolution of 1917. I haven't got time to go into great detail about the Russian Revolution, but what you saw over the year of 1917 was the revolutionary classes, the workers and peasants, overthrowing the old Tsarist order and then the new bourgeois capitalist order, and putting in place a worker state and workers' democracy and organization from below that could form the basis of a new way of democratically organizing the economy. And again, revolutionaries at the time who were participating and watching that revolution learned a great deal about mass movements, popular democracy, and in particular the types of bodies that working people can create in the midst of revolution that can form the new basis of society. And I'll return to this again. The other two revolutions I talk about are more recent ones. The Egyptian revolution of 2011, which was part of the Arab Spring, an incredibly powerful movement that overthrew a military dictator, Hosni Mubarak, and saw incredibly inspiring moments of mass participatory democracy, of strikes, general strikes, and so on. And the fourth revolution, again, similarly, was the revolution that is currently still ongoing in Sudan, which began in October of 2019, again saw the overthrow of a military dictatorship and saw the mass participation of hundreds of thousands of working people, ordinary men and women, in democratic sit-ins outside the military headquarters, as well as strikes and other protest movements. And again, the creation of democratic bodies of participation and revolutionary organization from below. And I write about Egypt and Sudan because I think it is important in the context of the environmental crisis that when we're discussing mass social movements and revolutionary movements, we don't focus overly on the global north. We can learn a great deal from revolutions in Europe, revolutionary movements, workers' movements in the global north. Of course we can, but we mustn't neglect the fact that those in the global south have also a grand revolutionary tradition and are often part of attempting to resist both the legacies of colonialism, imperialism and so on, but also the new sort of imperialism that arises out of the climate crisis and so on. And I think particularly in Sudan, where the revolution has thrown up all sorts of organizational questions and revolutionary questions, you also see the coming together of revolutionary movements and environmental impacts. A month or so back, there was a day of general strike had been called by the revolutionary committees in Sudan, and there was a big debate inside the movement as extreme weather brought floods and destruction to parts. Should the strikes carry on, or should they be cancelled and delayed in the midst of this crisis? And I think these sort of dynamics can teach us a lot, both in the global north, but also globally, about the types of movements that we need. But all four of those movements, all four of those revolutions, and many of the other mass movements and revolutionary moments I talk about in the book, bring up particular tactical organizational questions. And in particular, they bring up one, which I think is often misunderstood and neglected inside the environmental movement. And that's the question of the capitalist state. Now, for Marxists, the state is the bodies and organizations inside society that exist to protect and maintain the status quo, to protect the interests of the bourgeoisie, to protect the interests of the capitalists, to protect the interests of big business, the police, the armed forces, the judiciary, the laws, and so on. And I think the question of the state is remarkably important to the environmental movement. The first thing is most environmentalists, and certainly here in Britain, where we've seen activists on the streets around the Just Stop Oil protest, learn the lessons of the state very, very quickly. When the policeman comes and tries to break up your picket line or your protest, or to move you on, or to arrest you, you're experiencing the sharp end of the state. But the capitalist state is not just the repression you experience when you're on a protest, a strike, or a mass movement. It's also the way the system protects its interests against revolutionary challenges from below. And I think all too many environmentalists and sometimes left-wingers misunderstand the state, see it as a sort of neutral body in society that can be won over to their interests. And the lessons of the Paris Commune and the Russian Revolution in particular demonstrate that actually workers' movements revolutionary movements cannot seize control of the state. They have to smash the old capitalist state and to form new institutions that can form, at least temporarily, the basis for a worker state to protect the revolutionary movements. And if there is one argument in the book I wanted to articulate and push as a way of challenging in a fraternal and friendly way many of the fellow activists inside the environmental movement, it is that understanding of the capitalist state and the mechanisms of repression that it uses. And of course, there is important corollaries to the environmental movement here, important lessons for the environmental movement. Firstly, the overlap between the interests of those forces that are most destructive to the environment and the capitalist system and the capitalist state itself. The fossil fuel economy, for instance, which is very central to the environment, has often very great overlaps with the state and the capitalist system itself. We saw it at the COP26 conference when there was something like 500 delegates attending that conference who were in some form or the other linked to or employed by fossil fuel corporations. You see it very clearly here in Britain. Our temporary Prime Minister, Liz Truss, actually worked for after leaving Oxford University, worked for the Shell oil company, and some would argue is still working for the oil industry. Now she's in number 10 Downing Street, because the first things that she did coming into power was to attempt to allow and free up the oil companies to use fracking and to exploit oil reserves in the North Sea. More insidiously, though, there is a overlap, as I said, between the interests of capital and the interests of the fossil fuel corporations. And this arises out of the historic development of capitalism, capitalism develops at a particular point in time, and then it quickly adopts fossil fuels as its dominant way of producing energy. And thus, by the 21st century, the fossil fuel corporations, those big multinationals, have become absolutely central to a system of production, a global system of production. And this is one reason why it makes it so hard to reform or, how can one say, change the capitalist economy in any way in an environmental, in a sustainable way, because the interests of those fossil fuel corporations use their wealth, their power to undermine and hold back the movement, at the same time as pressurizing and forcing those governments forcing governments to do their wishes and do their interests, which is why you get this appalling contradiction of where we're in the midst of a great climate crisis. Every scientist, every activist, millions of people know that what needs to be done is to stop the burning of the fossil fuels, to move towards greener and more sustainable forms of energy. Yet actually governments are responding to economic crisis by pushing and channeling and and giving extra benefits to the very same fossil fuel companies that are causing the problem in the first place. This contradiction is rooted very, very much in the interests of capital and the dynamic of capitalist production over time. So one of the things we do in the book, or I do in the book, is to explain how that process, how capitalism has developed, and then attempt to say, actually, how can we get back to it, and how can we challenge this, how can we change this? And I was in the book, I very much argue that the force to change the world, that the force in society to challenge and break the capitalist state, and the force in the world that is able to overturn and destroy capitalism is the organized working class, whether that's the working people of the global north, of countries like Britain and Canada and the United States, or whether it's also working people and producers and peasants in the global south. Another reason, as an aside, why looking at revolutions in the Middle East, in Sudan and so on, is so important when they have agrarian economies. We must never forget that the world isn't the same everywhere in terms of how materials are produced. Now, workers, as I hope has been clear, are absolutely central to that system of production. It's without workers, there are no profits, no wheels turn, no food is produced, no people are cared for in hospitals, no children are educated. And that centrality of workers gives them enormous power within society. It also, however, is important for Marxists that we emphasize that the role and the centrality and the importance of the working class as a force to overthrow capitalism doesn't simply lie in their centrality or in their role at the heart of production. It isn't simply that they can go on strike and stop the capitalists. It is also that, as doing so, they can create the institutions from below that can form the basis for new direct participation in the economy and in production. And so what I do in the book all the time when looking at those revolutions, at those mass movements of the past, is to show how, as workers come into conflict with the system, they have always attempted to self-organize and to create the basis for their own sort of organizations, which at times of revolutions can grow into the types of organizations, whether they're workers' councils or Soviets, that could form the basis for a new socialist society, and I would argue a sustainable way of organising the economy. I haven't got time now, as I come to the end of my talk, to talk in detail about what that socialist society might look like. In the book, I explore some of the ways that direct democracy, democratic participation of the mass of producers in the economy can work to create a sustainable economy. And I look at some of the new ideas around how artificial intelligence, the internet and electronic communication and so on could encourage a process which, when we look at it in the Russian Revolution or earlier revolutions, was a much more chaotic and harder process. But I want to finish in my last minute or so by taking us back to the grand picture of revolution. You see, I use a quote in the book from George Lukács, a Hungarian revolutionary of the earlier 20th century. And he talked about the actuality of revolution. And by that, he didn't mean that we revolutionaries would go out and make a revolution, that we would explode bombs or do things that would dynamite and create a revolutionary movement out of nowhere. What he argued is that capitalism, in all its different eras, has all sorts of tensions and fissures and fractures in it that eventually will force working people into a confrontation with the system itself. And that has never been so clear as it has been today, when around the world, in almost every part of the world that you look at, the contradictions of capitalism are forcing people to resist, whether it is environmental crisis, forcing people to challenge and demand water or food or safety or whatever, or whether it is war, the imperialist conflict between NATO and Russia as manifested in Ukraine, the potential conflict between America and China, causing people to fear for the future, or of course economic crisis, driving people into poverty globally. And what Lukács meant is, he said that the potential for revolution is always there. It's an actuality for working people. And what revolutionaries and socialists must do constantly is attempt to develop movements and revolutionary processes that can make the likely victory of workers in a future revolution better, by organizing the way that generalizes experiences, that brings people together, that links, unites, and struggles together, and brings together questions of economic struggle, political struggle, and anti-oppression movements. And I think that's the important lesson for us today. As we look at a world in crisis, we have to point to the possibility of revolution, not just as an abstract question, but as a hope for the future, a vision of how a process can exist that can destroy the old order at the same time as beginning to create from below a new way of running and organizing society in the interest not just of people but also of the planet. So for me, the book is about the horrors of capitalism, but also the hope of revolution and the urgent need for a revolutionary change if we're to survive and have a long-term future in the planet. Thank you very much, everyone.